Welcome, everyone, to Latter Daily Digest. We honor creators, and we've had Joseph Geisner on the show before. He has produced a book that we interviewed about called Writing Mormon History, and now we have Writing Mormon History 2 that we're going to discuss with Joe. And thanks for being on the show, Joe.
You're welcome.
And thanks, Debbie, for co-hosting. Debbie is a very curious person, and so I'm happy to have her on the show. So what can you say, Joe, about this book? And we'll refer people to our prior interviews so they can know a little bit more about you and a little bit more about, I think we talked a lot about Mike Quinn in our very first show because you had some access to his information.
And I would call him, well, definitely one of my mentors, but also one of my friends. In fact, I was saying I say it to a lot of people, but I think it was Brian Buchanan the other day. I said, there's almost not a day goes by that I don't miss Mike. Somebody asked me a question the other day. I think it's Mormon Hierarchy. Oh, it was Mike Homer in Mormon Hierarchy, Origins of Power. Mike says that Warren Porter Rockwell, after he killed Worrell, who was one of the people, I don't know if he was a Carthage Grey or not, but he was one of the people that claimed he murdered Joseph Smith and Hiram Smith. And so Warren Porter Rockwell murdered him in turn. And then Mike says in Origins of Power that Warren Porter Rockwell then went out and murdered two more people at the camp where the anti-Mormons, where the mob crats, I think, were. And so we went looking. Both Mike and I went down a deep hole and went looking, Mike Homer, and I tried to find this source, and we can't find it. He said it was in, I know what. He said it was in William Clayton's journal. And I've asked friends who have access to Clayton's journal, and they've said no, it's not there.
Right.
So anyway, so I wish Mike was around to ask.
How many authors did you interview for the book number 1?
I think there were
13.
Let me just see here, but yeah, I think.
And I suppose you might have requested
15,
25 or 30 people, and 15 said they would do it. I don't know what are the odds.
Probably, I would say that probably, yeah.
And how many volumes could be done if people warmed up to the fact that this was a good project? 10 volumes. You think you can do? You think you can interview or get people to write?
Right. It's not
150 pieces, 150 Mormon historians.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And, it would be, and again, wouldn't it be wonderful to have, Jim Allen, for example, just passed away. It would have been wonderful to have had him, so yeah, it would be nice to have had the people that I've asked, but how many, it would be nice to say maybe 100, 150. This volume actually has more. Let's see. It's
and I know the first volume came out during COVID, like right when COVID.
April.
Happened.
What did we do? We went underground, I think the end of March, right?
Yeah.
And burrowed into the ground, and then then the book came out, and it was so.
Yeah, and so it was hard. You couldn't do any like signings or
no. And unfortunately, we're now at the holidays, which is a great time for book sales, but I just because of the type of work I do, I can't get away to Utah to do book signings until probably after the first of the year. I don't see myself being able to do it before, which is unfortunate.
You're just not dedicated enough to your craft. That's all.
That's it. And there are 18 to answer your question.
Right.
In here, there are 18 people. So 2 people wrote a chapter together.
Okay.
And we could start out with, so their chapter it's written by P.J. Hafen, who is a scholar. She taught at UNLV. And,
is she LDS?
Yes, she is.
Because Bruce Hafen is a name that comes to my mind that might have been like a 70 or a BYU professor.
That is, Bruce was a sorry, I'm trying to find because I should have had this biography handy for myself. But Jane, she goes by Jane, and Jane is she's Taos Pueblo, a professor emerita of English at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. So I was right, UNLV. She's won all kinds of awards. I mean, like all kinds of awards. The book that this chapter that she wrote in here is called, and she did it with Brendan Rensick. And Brendan and she did Essays on American Indian and Mormon History. So it is not plural, by the way. It is American Indian. So more, and it's got it's a great anthology. It actually won best anthology for John Whitmer, which I happen to be on. I was chair of the committee, though I did not vote for it because as chair I was the tiebreaker, and it clearly won, and I supported that. The other person that wrote the chapter about the Indian and Mormon history anthology is Brendan Rensink. Sorry, Brendan. He's the associate director of the Charles Redd Center for Western Studies at BYU and also a professor of history at BYU. He has done work on the Joe Smith Papers documents. He manages events and programming awards and research at the Redd Center at BYU. I know he travels a great deal organizing events. They have a great outreach at the Charles Redd Center at BYU. I'm going to go alphabetical from here on out so that it'll be easier for me to. And if you have any questions about any of these people, please. So Gary Bajera, he wrote his chapter on the Seventh East Press. Now, the first book was strictly, I really wanted it to be about people who had written a book. I became more flexible, and Gary approached me at the beginning of the second volume and said, "Hey, I've written a chapter on the Seventh East Press, but it doesn't really fall into your criteria because Seventh East Press was a newspaper." And I said to Gary, though, I was actually a student. I had just gotten back off my mission. You were a student there too at the same time. Okay.
My wife was.
Oh, Michelle was. Mm-hmm. Okay. And so I just gotten home off my mission. My mission changed my outlook, changed a lot of things.
For good or for bad?
I think for good, ultimately. Okay. I remember my scoutmaster, he he was, I think, in the bishopric now at this point, a wonderful man, just passed away a few years ago. And Newell said to me after I gave my homecoming talk in Sacrament, he said, "Joe, you left a boy and you came back a man." Now, there were some reasons for that, because missions are very difficult and a lot of emotional trauma, a lot of abuse. had, and I've probably said this on so many different podcasts, but I had nightmares for a good 30 years after my mission. I would wake up. Now, the first 10 years, they were weekly at least, the nightmares, even at times more. And this is not uncommon. It's actually more common. And a friend of mine actually did a dissertation on returned missionaries, and I wanted him to include that because the main impetus for his dissertation was to show that missions actually that those men remain active longer than somebody who doesn't. So, well, in my case, obviously that didn't work out really well, but I wanted him to interview and say, how many of these people also have these nightmares, and the nightmare is that you're living in today's world. So I was married, and then when I started having children, so then I had children with the nightmare as well. But I was called back. I had to go back for 6 more months on my mission, and it was a horror, just a real horror story kind of a thing, because
it wasn't because the prophet wanted to marry your wife while you were gone.
No, it wasn't that. It was that I was being pulled away from my family,
right?
And that was and I would wake up in a sweat. And it's
that
not
is similar to like a veteran, like someone who's been in active combat. That is crazy to hear that you had that same identifying experience, because that is serious PTSD.
Yeah.
And you signed up for it, but like you didn't say, I don't know, maybe you saved a soul, but it wasn't holy.
He saw a lot of spiritual death on his mission.
Or experienced spiritual death. I mean,
and where'd you go, Joe?
Colorado. So I wasn't even a foreign
you
mission.
weren't even out of the country. Oh my
God. Though I did there were knifings in front of our apartment. Yeah. We were just off Colfax, and we couldn't live in our area. And I had 2 areas in Denver, my first area and then the middle of my mission. And neither one of them could we actually live in our area because it was too expensive for missionaries. So we had to live more in the not as expensive areas. Okay. They weren't bad in the sense that, it wasn't like living in Brazil, in the poor areas of Brazil or
that's right. And the current movie that's out, Heretic, happened in Colorado, right?
Oh, I don't know. I haven't seen it.
I think so.
It does. It's based in Colorado. Yes.
Oh, fun. Well,
yeah. So when you see it, you'll get more nightmares.
Probably.
You'll be re-triggered. Actually, this is probably a warning label, Joe. Don't.
Yeah.
Do it.
Well, I haven't had one now in quite a few years. So
that's good.
Yeah. It would be about it went all the way down to about once a year. And then I think even maybe once every couple of years. And now the last.
That's right. And do we need to go back to Gary Bergera, or do we need to go back to somewhere in between?
So I'm not even sure why I went off on this tangent now, but anyway, so 70s Press.
Oh, right.
So get home off my mission, and there's I think in September, so pretty new after gotten back, I started reading the 70s Press. They were on campus. They weren't much. They were in a paper dispenser machine, and I think we had to put a quarter in. I think they were. So if I had a spare quarter, which was not often, but I had a spare quarter as a brand new returned missionary at BYU, but I'd put the quarter in and get the paper out. And the funny story about that is that they covered after Bruce McConkie attacked George Pace in the devotional. I don't think it was a fireside. about his book. 70s Press. I mean, I think the Universe hardly said anything about it, but 70s Press covered it fully. And I had Joseph Fielding McConkie as my religion professor. And I remember walking into class after the paper, and Joseph Fielding McConkie said something like, "There is an evil presence on this campus, and it's a newspaper. I don't even know. You know, they do that where they won't even talk about the name." So,
You got trouble right here in River City.
That's right.
Okay.
And so
Voldemort.
it was shortly after that it got banned from campus. And then it was downhill from there because they lost their advertisers.
Right. Got banned from campus as far as like having dispensaries or whatever, but they still like pass it out to students or something.
No, you could only buy it off campus.
Right.
So talk about destroying a printing press. Oh my goodness.
Yeah. Well, and that's what's exciting about this chapter that Gary wrote. Is so it's a history. Now it's not a complete history, okay? Gary
it's his view of the events.
Now Gary was not a regular staff person. He wrote a column and he did some other things. And his husband was one of the editors, Ron Prudis. And so, you know, it's not like Gary doesn't have inside information on what occurred. So, and he had interviewed, and there's oral histories. And so he wrote this history, and I read it, not even realizing it a few years later after Gary wrote it, because writing Mormon history has taken about 4 years.
So he wrote that in like 2019 or something?
Or, well, it was actually something he'd written even a year or two before that.
Okay.
So, and then he shared it with me, though, No, he wouldn't have shared it. It was after the first book. So it would have been like May or June of 2020. He shared the article with me, or the chapter. And so then a few years later, 2023, 2022, something like that, I reconnect with Dean Huffaker, who was the last editor of 70s Press. Now, Dean, when he left BYU, he basically left Mormonism, and that was after the 70s Press had collapsed, and so nobody has ever heard his story, his side of those events. So I convinced Dean, who's not written anything Mormon since those days, to write his personal reflections on the 70s Press. So this is the first time in Writing Mormon History 2, the first time that anybody will get to see Dean Huffaker's side of it. And he was the one who, as editor, he was the one who was attacked for publishing and the McConkie. But what really did 70s Press and most people know this, so I'm not really revealing a shocking event, but now I can't think of his name. But anyway, he interviewed Sterling McMurrin, this person. He's now an apologist, and so he wrote this. He interviewed Sterling McMurrin, and Sterling McMurrin. One of the things, and I won't say it correctly, Sterling was one of the most articulate people I've ever met in my life. And he was John Kennedy's, they didn't call him Secretary of Education, but after John Kennedy was assassinated, I think during the Johnson administration, they then started calling that person Secretary of Education. Sterling, they had another name for it, Commissioner. I think it was Commissioner of Education. But that was Sterling. Sterling was John Kennedy's Secretary of Education. So Sterling said, you don't get books from angels with gold plates. And so this was published in the 70s Press, and this whole interview. And that's when the proverbial poop hit the fan. And so that really, and that interview had actually been done, I think, before Dean even became editor, but it was there in the queue to be published. So Dean did that. The other thing that Dean did that is maybe the coolest thing, and I've actually, thank goodness, I've actually got a copy of this. I'm sure there are others. And by the way, Seventh East Press is available online, the entire run. A friend of mine was kind enough, a BYU person, was kind enough to scan all the issues and send me a copy. And then I, in turn, sent it to Signature Books, and they posted it on their website. Dean did a April Fool's issue, and it is hysterical. Like, they've got something about the MX missiles on the front cover, and it's funny. It's not vicious. It is not anti anything. It's just a parody of BYU life, done in a very kind and very creative way. And Dean did this. He was really the impetus behind this. And obviously BYU admitted. Oh, and they went and put these, the staff went around and put the April Fool's issue in. BYU used to, and I don't know if they still have this. I don't even know if they print the Daily Universe. I know it's online, but I don't know if it's printed anymore. But they had boxes that you would go around, and as you were walking to class, you'd grab your copy of the Daily Universe and take it into class. And the professor would even usually, he or she would be up front and reading the Daily Universe, when you walked in that morning. And those were the days that Steve Benson and Pat Bagley were the cartoonists, So there were some really good cartoons. But anyway, so the staff of the Seventh East Press went around and put these April Fool issues in those boxes. Right. And so the students, it took a while for students actually to figure out that this was a parody, that this was actually done. And I don't even know, I know I don't even think at the time I realized as a student that it was done by Seventh East Press. We knew it was done by somebody, but I'm not sure if it came out. And it wasn't until later that I learned, after I had left BYU, that it was done by Seventh East Press. So yeah. So anyway,
Stephen Benson won the Pulitzer Prize in 1993 for his Arizona Republic cartoons
on Gov Meekum, right?
Political cartoons.
Yeah, I think it was on Gov Meekum, which there's a whole Sunstone issue.
So he was good. That's what I'm saying.
Good. He was very good. Yeah, and he just retired just a year or two ago. So, okay, so you have 2 chapters on Seventh East Press, and the reason I advocated for Gary's original article was because think who all came out of that. I mean, really, truly, the whole next generation of historians were all involved, from Maxine Hanks to Albert Peck and Ron Prittis. I mean, and I would be, that's just the touch of, and even the professors who were involved. I think Scott Abbott, or maybe Scott was on the staff. I don't know.
Fletcher Stack on it. Peggy Fletcher Stack on it.
No, her sister. Her sister. And that's actually how Dean, and that is part of the story that Dean tells, how that connection all came about. And I'm not going to ruin that, because that's a fun story.
That's right. Go read it.
How that, yeah. So, okay, the next person is Matt Bowman, Matthew Bowman. And Matt is, he's one of the great new Mormon historians. And I'm not using that in the terms of the New Mormon History, okay? The New Mormon History really doesn't exist today. The New Mormon history that I read and that I studied and that I learned
in the 70s and 80s.
It doesn't exist anymore. So, but Matt is the Howard W. Hunter Chair for Mormon Studies at Claremont Graduate University, and he wrote the book The Mormon People, and it's really matter of fact, I would say it's like the one of three of the great one-volume histories of, and I tell the story in Writing Mormon History 1 about the story of the Latter-day Saints, which I think is one of those three: Jim Allen, Glenn Leonard's, and then Matt Bowman's, and then now we have Ben Park, and I can't think of the title of his book. Zion,
American Zion.
American Zion, right? Okay, so that's the third. But Matt writes about his writing The Mormon People. Alice Faulkner Birch, she's from Oakland, California. She's a person of color, and she is an active, believing member of the church. And just because I don't say that about people, I don't know. Most of these people, I don't know. I've never gotten involved in their. That was never a concern to me. In the sense, I wanted to present various sides in my volumes, but I wasn't so concerned about their belief structure, in the sense that I wanted their story. That's what I wanted. But Alice has made it clear in public settings, so that's why I don't feel uncomfortable saying that. She is a Deseret book editor, author. Her book is about members of the church who are Black and who they tell their story. And her book is called My Lord, He Calls Me. It's a very important book. And so she tells about that. Joe Mauvais Dur, I see this, and most people who are insiders of Mormon history see this as a coup that I was able to get Jill to write a chapter. Jill wrote the official history of the Relief Society that was published by Deseret Book. And she also...
The world's largest women's organization run by men.
That's correct.
Did she tell the real history, or did she tell the...
Faithful.
I'm going to let you read her chapter. The book itself follows the New Mormon History model. And the New Mormon History model was to tell faithful history in a scholarly way.
Yes.
And if Jill had her way, at least if you, after you read her chapter, we need to talk about it, because I think she wanted to tell way more, but that's my opinion. Okay. That is Jill is great and is never, she's a class act. And so, but her chapter, everybody who's read her chapter that's insiders are blown away. Okay.
That sounds amazing, because there's such a history there that is, I think, not known to most people who don't study the history of the church, especially for that organization, because they were such, I think, a powerful force within the church, the organization as it is. So, wow.
Yeah, she worked on that book for a long time. She was specifically picked to write that history. Now, it's written with three other people. Janeth Cannon was one of the co-authors, and just to learn about the interactions with Jill and Janeth is worth the price of admission on the book. Okay, because Janeth was, I think she was either the Relief Society president at the time that the book, or she had just been released. So you can see a lot of dynamics going on.
I have some Relief Society stories, but one is that we used to go to ward bazaars so that the Relief Society could earn money and send back to headquarters so that the Relief Society could produce their own lesson material, I believe, and govern the structure, run the structure of Relief Society.
And that's
well, it didn't.
Oh,
I
go
don't
ahead.
think it used to be that way until the church realized how much money those women had made for themselves.
There's
and
two
what-
stories about that, actually.
Yeah, like that they were literally their own organization, and then the church finally looked at them and were like, "Hey, we want some of that," and took away all their power and all their abilities.
And
I
that's
mean,
actually in the book that on the Relief Society history. Okay, it doesn't say it obviously doesn't say it exactly the way that we're talking about it, but that's there. I mean, it's like, he who has ears, let him hear. You know, he who has eyes, let him see. You know.
Yes. So I know one thing is, like, either during the war or during the Great Depression, the Women's Relief Society had storehouses of grains or something,
Of wheat.
and the church,
Yeah.
from our point of view, confiscated it so that for their political benefit. And the faithful presentation might be that the Lord prepared that so that the church could gain political favor, right? And sort of whitewash the fact that the women's efforts were diminished.
Again, Jill's chapter will knock your socks off. It
Sounds
does
amazing.
help if you're. It does help if you know, like when Susan Staker read it, she writes a blurb on the back of the book, and Susan called me and said, "Joe, how in the world did you get Jill to write this chapter?" You know, and it was like, yeah. And see, and Susan wrote her chapter for the first book, and Susan wrote the official history of the primary. And Susan has a fun story that she likes to tell, is that when she wrote the up to the 20th century, I think, her part of the primary history, or maybe it was like mid 20th century. She didn't write the modern stuff. She wrote the history part, and because that's what Susan was good at, and the research and writing. Amazing writer, actually. And so Jill, Leonard didn't, well, I don't want to say it wrong. Leonard was not going to have Susan's name on this book called Sisters and Little Saints. That's the official history.
Leonard Arrington.
And Leonard Arrington. And Jill pushed for it and got Susan's name on the book. So, and it wasn't that Leonard fought Jill over it. It's just that he just didn't think about it, because Jill had a name for herself. She was a PhD, and Susan wasn't a PhD, hadn't created a name for herself at that point.
Didn't need to publish or perish, so he didn't think she needed it, maybe.
Right. And so, anyway, so Jill pushed the issue and got Susan's name. But when Susan turned in her part of the book, which was the history part, not the modern so much, Boyd Packer was their reader on the General Authority Advisory. And so he was the reader for these official histories. And he came back, and his comment was to Leonard, I think it was to Leonard, he said, or whoever was above Susan and Jill, and that where's the men? There's no men in the story. And Susan's response was, yeah, because there weren't any men involved. This was women did everything. There were no, and his comment was, well, you got to somehow insert men into the story, you know.
Oh.
And it was like, Susan was like, how do you insert men into this story? You know? And Susan then, you know, the founder, Susan's going to kill me because I can't remember the founder's name. But anyway, she and her longtime lover, a woman, would travel. And matter of fact, she made her counselor so that they could travel around. So Susan obviously wanted to include that in the official history, but wasn't able to. So she wrote a Utah State Historical Society article and discusses it in that. So anyway, my friend Rick Grunder is he is the ultimate bibliomaniac, bibliophile maniac. Pete Crawley, and really Pete really was. I mean, he was the guy that we all would bow down to. But Rick, when it came to books and documents and things, but Rick was a student of Pete's, in the sense that Pete taught Rick a great deal, and Rick has just been amazing. So Rick has done, I think it's 4 volumes. I don't have them handy right now, the set, but it's a 4-volume set called Mormon Parallels. And what Rick has done is, over his 40 years, I think now, or maybe it's longer, maybe 50 years of being in the book world, because I'm including now his BYU years, which he did under Chad Flake at BYU. And Chad was like, also, I mean, Chad, you could go to Chad and ask him a question, and he knew everything about everything, kind of, you know. And it's the same with Pete Crawley. And so, Rick has been doing that and put together these 4 volumes of documents and I'm sorry, not documents, publications, booklets, broadsides, books that all have to do with things that you could then find in the Book of Mormon, you could find in Doctrine and Covenants, the Temple.
There could be direct connections, or there could be just tangential connections.
Rick would be closer to the tangential. He would be,
and a bibliographer compiles lists of publications that are grouped together, so that people, if they wanted to study a subject, could look to that list and say, okay, I need to read these things in order to write a book about that subject. Is that correct?
And the beauty of Rick's work is that he takes the extracts out of the publications and has them in his bibliography. So if you're reading, and you know, Alma, let's just, I don't know, you know, I'm just throwing this out, but let's say Alma 21. Okay, there's some big, in one of those Alma chapters, there's some big long teaching that Alma does, and
we all knew 40 years ago.
And Rick, right, exactly, that Rick found, you know, a broadside or a book or whatever, and it's like, you know, it's almost like the author of the Book of Mormon, like Alma or whoever wrote the Book of Mormon, had a time machine to come forward and read this publication in the 1790s or 1815, and read this, and then write it, you know, go back in time and then write
a synopsis of it.
Yeah. So it's really, so that's Rick's.
And we'll say to our young viewers, which is like, in a way, everybody, that a broadside would be the equivalent of a really long Facebook post 150 years ago.
That's exactly, or 200 years ago. Martin Luther, when he did his list of the criticisms of the Vatican, was a broadside. You know, that's probably one of that. In fact, that may be the most famous broadside. I think there were some broadsides that some of the early founding fathers.
In a way, the Declaration of Independence is a broadside.
It is. It really is. That's exactly. And it was actually used as a broadside because, because that first publication was a broadside. So yeah.
And we'll say the Declaration of Independence is a little bit more famous than Martin Luther King Jr.'s. But
no, Martin Luther King. Or Martin Luther, not Martin Luther King.
Oh, Martin Luther. Right.
Did I say
109 things wrong with the Catholic Church or whatever?
Yeah, did I say Martin Luther King?
I don't remember. I inserted that.
And it's not even Black History Month. I don't know what that's all about.
Yeah.
Anyway, so and Rick also wrote a book of fiction called 116, and it's a murder mystery about the 116-page manuscript set in modern times among book collectors, and so it's pretty cool. Rick also,
that's almost in honor of Mark Hoffman.
Yeah. Well, Rick, to show you, okay, so Rick, one of Rick's closest friends was, well, his name will come to me, but anyway,
Associated with Mark?
yeah, was the guy who actually claimed that Mark convinced him to claim that he was the one who found the salamander letter. That is horrible. You know, I'm getting too old.
Is that the guy in the documentary Murder Among the Mormons?
No, that's Shannon. That's Shannon. Shannon did not know. It was Jacobs, Lynn Jacobs.
Lynn Jacobs.
And Lynn Jacobs. And Lynn died of AIDS. I don't know what year, 90s, I think. But anyway, but Rick was really close friends with Lynn, which brought him into the world of Mark Hoffman. Now, Rick was lucky. Rick didn't live in Utah. He lived in New York. And Mark was only going to strip shows and bars when he was in New York. So Rick wasn't going to strip shows and bars. So, and so they had very
doing
little
research.
Yeah, that's right.
That's good. Tim Ballard took over that.
I was going to say
right.
the research ruse.
Yeah, you know, the similarities continue on with those two. But anyway, I don't want to be sued by Ballard. But anyway,
I know, right? We've got to watch our mouths.
So, but yeah, so but Mark Hoffman did have, you know, that connection with Rick, and matter of fact, Rick, one of the documents Rick was questioning, and it didn't make Mark very happy, and so Rick was not allowed to see documents again.
He got demoted.
Yeah. So anyway, so that's Rick. The next person is Condon Smith Hansen. Now, Condon and Matt Bowman, Condon, and Taylor Petrie, those three all fit this mold of what I call now this new group.
Newer Mormon history.
Scholars, this new historians. And so Condon wrote a book called Frontier Religion. And he also did the Reed Smoot hearings with Mike Paulos. But Condon gives us a glimpse into what it's like to be a up and coming scholar, PhD, what it's like to go get your PhD. And guess who he had as his main professor was Val Avery. And so we get to see insights of Val Avery again.
And she helped write Mormon Enigma.
She was the co-author with Linda Newell, who wrote the chapter in Writing Mormon History, the first volume. And Val unfortunately passed away from cancer before she would have had her write the chapter, you know, and giving her side. Plus, Val did other things.
And just really quickly about Mormon Enigma, about Emma Smith, is my recollection in the 60s and 70s is Emma Smith was not to be talked about, except for that for a little while she was good enough to do the hymn book. And that was the only props that Emma Smith got. And then because of Mormon Enigma, they started celebrating Emma's contribution to early Mormonism. And that's that's my take.
Right. Linda's and Val's writings, because they also wrote some articles, changed the way that Emma Smith was looked at by and now she's almost become a woman that is held up to be emulated. You know, what do we call there's a name, you know, but she was basically
hero,
but heroine, right?
Heroine of Mormonism.
and which is very interesting. I always say history is a little bit more complicated than, heroes, heroines, and villains, and so I have mixed feelings about Emma Smith. I do think she put up with a lot. I think that she was an abused woman. But at the same time, I also can't get out of my head what William Law said about her, which she was cut from the same cloth as Joseph Smith.
I agree with that 100%. That girl had some teeth. I mean, everyone wants to make her sound like she was this doormat. I don't think so. That girl probably instigated as much as she wanted to complain. I'm sure she was there stirring that pot. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, she was. William Law felt she was just as crooked and evil as Joseph Smith. Yeah. So like I say,
and she helped start 2 religions.
History is way more complicated than, and she did help start 2 religions. She really did.
Well, and it makes you wonder, like, was she as much on board as like Joseph's story, like that origin story? I think she was definitely like the one paving that road for Joseph's history.
Yeah.
Mystery.
There are times when they both act like they have something on each other, for sure.
Yeah. And I think she had way more on him than he had on her, because the only time we ever have any evidence again is that she was interested in another man, which was William Law, and William Law wanted nothing to do with him. He was happily married with Jane.
He saw right through her.
Yeah, right. So Condon gives us and by the way, his Reed Smoot Hearings book did win also John Whitmer Best Anthology the year it came out. So he's an award winner. He is a professor at the University of Arizona, Tucson.
And one thing we can take away from the Reed Smoot Hearings is that Joseph F. Smith did not receive any revelation.
That's right. That's right.
And he didn't know anybody that did.
And he didn't know. Actually, he didn't know about anything.
He didn't know that the Deseret News was the arm of the church.
Yeah, he didn't
know that. So that concludes part A of our discussion with Joe Geisner about Writing Mormon History 2, the book it's on sale at Benchmark and on Amazon, and we'll have links in our show's description. And thanks everybody for watching. And tomorrow or the next time we'll post part B, we're calling it. And so everybody like and subscribe and have a great rest of the year.